Somewhere in Indianapolis, there is a piece of paper. On that paper, one box is checked. The box says, nonprofit. Okay, so you want to be a college athlete. You're picturing a packed stadium on a Saturday afternoon, your name on the back of a jersey, maybe a bowl game on national television. Here's the number that should change that picture. In fiscal year 2024, the organization that governs your sport reported $1.38 billion in revenue. Record high. And for 83 years, from its founding in 1906 until 2021, the athlete generating that revenue was legally barred from being paid a single dollar for it. Not a typo, not an exaggeration, a rule. The NCAA calls itself an association of colleges. On paper, it's a nonprofit. In practice, it negotiates a $920 million television contract. It employs a president who used to run a state, and it sits at the center of an industry that, across just the top 75 athletic departments in the country, generated $11.84 billion last year alone. That's not a typo either. $11.84 billion, flowing through institutions that call themselves, legally, educational charities. Somebody is getting paid enormous sums of money in this system. For most of its history, it just wasn't the person on the field. Here's the illusion first, because it's the one that sells tickets. College sports is framed as amateur competition. Kids playing for the love of the game, for school pride, for a scholarship. Pure, in a way professional sports supposedly aren't. Here's the reality. 9 college athletic departments generated more than $200 million in total operating revenue in a single year, up from just 5 the year before. The University of Texas football program alone brought in $182 million in one season, more than the entire operating revenue of most professional soccer clubs in Europe. The men's basketball tournament in March, the one people fill office brackets for, is licensed to television networks for close to $1.1 billion a year on its own. None of that money is amateur in any sense a business analyst would recognize. It behaves exactly like professional sports revenue, because structurally, it is professional sports revenue. Media rights, ticket sales, sponsorship, merchandising. The only thing that was ever different, historically, was who was allowed to keep a share of it. And who wasn't allowed a share was extremely specific. Coaches could be paid. Athletic directors could be paid. University presidents could be paid. Marketing agencies, apparel companies, and television networks could all be paid. The one person whose performance the entire multi-billion-dollar apparatus existed to broadcast was, by rule, the only party in the transaction working for free. Consider the television math specifically, because it's the cleanest illustration of how professional this amateur enterprise actually is. The men's basketball tournament deal alone was worth roughly $873 million in its final year under the old contract, then rose to an expected $995 million in year one of the new agreement. On top of that, the NCAA separately signed an 8-year, $920 million contract just to cover its other 40 championships, averaging $115 million a year, more than double the $45.2 million that same package was worth just 1 year earlier. These are not booster club numbers. These are numbers that sit comfortably alongside professional league broadcast contracts. This is the split you need to hold in your head for the rest of this video. On one side, an industry with the revenue scale of a mid-sized professional league. On the other side, for most of the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st, a workforce legally classified as students who happen to play sports, not employees who happen to attend school. That distinction is not a technicality. It is the entire business model. The model survived for decades because it was written into the NCAA's own rulebook, enforced by the NCAA's own investigators, and defended in court by the NCAA's own lawyers, whenever anyone tried to challenge it. It survived a class action case brought by former UCLA basketball player Ed O'Bannon over the use of athletes' likenesses in video games. It survived years of state-level lobbying. It did not survive a 2021 Supreme Court case called NCAA versus Alston, where 9 justices, unanimously, ruled that the NCAA's limits on education-related compensation violated federal antitrust law. Justice Brett Kavanaugh's concurring opinion went further than the ruling itself required, writing bluntly that the NCAA's remaining compensation rules also raised serious antitrust questions. Weeks later, on July 1, 2021, The NCAA opened the door to name, image, and likeness deals for the first time in its history, not because it decided to, but because the legal ground it had been standing on for a century had just given out beneath it. That still wasn't the end of it. A separate case, House versus NCAA, filed by Arizona State swimmer Grant House, pushed one step further, arguing that athletes deserved a direct share of the actual broadcast and sponsorship revenue their performances generated, not just outside nil deals. We'll get to exactly how that case forced the industry's hand. But first, you need to understand what it cost to keep the old model running for as long as it did, and who is actually paying for it. Because the surprising answer is, usually not the football team. Here's the part almost nobody outside a university budget office ever sees. Running a Division I athletic department is expensive, and for the overwhelming majority of schools, it loses money. Not a handful of schools, not the small ones. According to the Knight Newhouse College Athletics database, more than 90% of intercollegiate athletic programs in the country operate at a deficit. Out of more than 230 Division I programs with reported data, only 16 take $0 in either mandatory student fees or direct institutional support. 16. Everyone else, including some of the most recognizable brands in American sports, needs a subsidy just to keep the lights on. Let's put a real number on that subsidy, because vague statistics don't hit the same way specific ones do. James Madison University collected $55.5 million in mandatory student fees in a single year. That accounted for 73% of its entire athletic budget. Not from ticket sales, not from a television contract, from a line item added automatically to every student's tuition bill, whether that student has ever attended a single game or not. Now here's where the escalation happens, because this pattern repeats across 3 tiers of the same industry, and the gap between the tiers is the whole story. At the bottom tier, a school like Towson charges its students $733 a semester in athletic fees. At a mid-tier public flagship like Virginia Tech, the mandatory fee is $384 a year, spread across a much larger student body of roughly 28,000, which is precisely why it looks smaller per person. At the University of Virginia, it's $720 a year. And at the very top of the pyramid, schools like Ohio State, Texas, and Alabama, the brands people actually recognize on television, charge their students close to nothing because they don't need to. Their television contracts already cover it. That's the barrier to entry nobody talks about when they picture the business of college football. It is not evenly distributed. It's not one industry with one economics. It's 2 industries wearing the same jersey. One industry is self-funding off 9-figure television deals. The other industry is a tuition surcharge dressed up as school spirit. And even inside the schools that do generate real revenue, the money doesn't spread evenly across sports either. At most Division I athletic departments, exactly one program consistently turns a profit: football. Occasionally, men's basketball joins it. Every other sport at that same school, every women's program, every non-revenue men's sport, from swimming to wrestling to soccer, is running at a structural loss, subsidized internally by the football program or externally by the students. Rutgers, a member of the Big Ten, one of the 2 wealthiest conferences in the country, posted an athletic department deficit exceeding $70 million in a single fiscal year. Being in a power conference is not a guarantee of profitability. It's a ticket to a bigger, more expensive game, with no refund if you lose. Even UCLA, one of the newest and most prestigious additions to that same Big Ten, still draws roughly 26% of its athletic budget from institutional support and mandatory student fees combined. That's the most subsidized program in the entire conference, sitting in the same television deal as schools that need almost nothing from their students. The gap isn't about talent or tradition. It's about which schools locked in football and basketball revenue large enough to be self-funding before the modern television economics kicked in, and which ones didn't. Zoom out to the national picture, and the scale of the subsidy becomes almost impossible to ignore. Across more than 1,100 schools in all 3 NCAA divisions, one nationwide accounting found $18.1 billion spent on athletics in a single year, against just $10.3 billion in revenue generated. That's nearly $8 billion in unrecovered cost. Of that gap, $6.5 billion came from direct institutional and government support, and $1.5 billion came straight from student fees. An earlier 5-year investigation by the Chronicle of Higher Education and the Huffington Post put the combined total of fees and subsidies over that period at $10.3 billion. And none of those tallies include the new revenue-sharing payments schools started making to athletes after 2025, a cost multiple universities have already covered, in part, by adding new athletic fees on top of existing ones. So before a single athlete ever sees $1 of revenue sharing, before a single booster writes a check for a name-image-likeness deal, the hidden cost structure of college sports already looks like this. A small number of football and basketball programs at the biggest brands generate real, professional-grade revenue. Almost everyone else is running a deficit that gets quietly paid down by the students who never asked to buy a ticket. So where does the real money actually go? Follow the television contract, because that's where the machine runs on autopilot. The Big Ten's current media rights deal, signed with Fox, CBS, and NBC, is worth more than $7 billion over 7 years, roughly $1.15 billion a year, more than double the conference's previous $440 million annual deal with the same partners. The SEC's deal with ESPN is worth close to $3 billion over 10 years, on top of a separate SEC network agreement that runs through 2034. Pushing the conference's annual media revenue towards $710 million and climbing. The ACC signed a 20-year, $4.8 billion agreement with ESPN running through 2036. Even the Big 12, widely seen as the fourth conference in a four-conference hierarchy, locked in a 6-year, $2.3 billion extension, nearly doubling its previous per-school payout. That money doesn't go to athletes first. It goes to the conference office, then gets distributed to member schools, and at each school, the largest single new expense competing for that money is the head coach. Here's where the escalation gets almost absurd. In 2022, Nick Saban's contract at Alabama made him the highest-paid coach in the sport, at roughly $11.7 million a year. By 2024, Georgia's Kirby Smart passed him, signing a 10-year, $130 million extension worth $13 million a year, the first coach in the sport's history to cross that threshold on an annual basis, with a buyout clause of $105 million if the university ever wanted to fire him. The average salary for a power conference head coach right now is $6.2 million a year. For comparison, across the same era, the average full professor at a public research university earns roughly 1/20th of that. Firing that coach doesn't stop the cash flow either, it just redirects it. Buyout clauses in major college football have grown just as fast as the salaries themselves. LSU, after firing its head coach, reportedly owed him as much as $47 million, money paid out for a coach no longer coaching a single game. Texas A&M's decision to move on from its own head coach in 2023 carried a reported price tag as high as $76 million. That's not an outlier penalty clause buried in fine print. It's become a standard, budgeted cost of doing business in a sport where the wrong hire is now judged not just on wins and losses, but on the size of the check required to undo it. Coaching salaries are not an accident of the market. They are the machine's central cash flow decision. A university with a $7 billion conference television check to justify will spend tens of millions of dollars to hire the one person believed capable of winning enough games to keep that check flowing. It is, structurally, closer to a media company paying a star anchor than a university paying an instructor. Then, in 2025, a new pipe opened directly to the athletes, and it's worth walking through carefully because it is genuinely new. Following the House v. NCAA settlement, schools were permitted, for the first time in the sport's history, to share revenue directly with current athletes, starting at a cap of $20.5 million per school for the 2025 to 26 academic year, rising at least 4% annually, projected to reach $32.9 million per school by 2034 to 35. Layer name-image-likeness deals on top of that, and Opendoors, the industry's leading nil data platform, projects college football player earnings climbing from roughly $1 billion in 2024 to $1.9 billion in 2025 to a projected $2.4 billion in 2026. But look at how that new pipe is split before you assume it's evenly shared. At most schools mirroring the settlement's own back payment formula, roughly 75% of the revenue share pool goes to football players. 15% goes to men's basketball, 5% to women's basketball. The remaining 5% is divided among every other sport at the school combined, from baseball to volleyball to track. Some schools have gone further, allocating more than 85% of the entire pool to football alone. Look closely at where that money is coming from within the nil pipeline itself, because the composition changed almost overnight. In 2024, before the settlement, college football players earned roughly $853.1 million from school-affiliated nil collectives and another $150.5 million from open market commercial deals. In 2025, the collective model largely dissolved, projected to shrink to just $213.4 million, while commercial deals nearly doubled to $290 million. The number that replaced the collective money entirely is the new institutional revenue share payment, projected at $1.4 billion in 2025 alone. In other words, the money didn't just grow. It moved from boosters writing informal checks through side entities to universities themselves cutting the checks directly, out in the open, on the athletic department's own books. That shift came bundled with a new set of constraints, because nothing in this industry moves without a trade-off attached. To manage the payments, schools now report every dollar through a centralized system called the College Athlete Payment System. And in exchange for the right to pay athletes directly, the settlement eliminated the old scholarship count limits and replaced them with hard roster caps instead, 105 total roster spots for football, 15 for basketball. Schools that had been carrying walk-on rosters well beyond those numbers were forced to cut players entirely, some of them mid-career, to fit inside the new math. A grandfather clause lets schools designate certain existing players to finish their careers outside the cap, but new arrivals don't get that protection. The same settlement that finally opened the pipe to pay athletes also closed the door on a portion of the roster that used to have a spot on the team at all. So the cash flow, top to bottom, looks like this. Television networks pay conferences. Conferences pay schools. Schools pay coaches first, at numbers that now rival professional sports, and pay athletes second, through a pipe that overwhelmingly favors one sport and comes with a smaller roster attached. Everyone in that chain is being paid something close to market rate for the first time in the industry's history. Everyone, that is, except the sports that were never generating the revenue in the first place, and the players who no longer have a roster spot to be paid from, which is exactly where we're headed next. If you want to see what happens when the television money incentive stops being subtle and just takes over completely, look at what happened to the Pac-12. Founded in 1915 as the Pacific Coast Conference, it was, for over a century, one of the most storied athletic conferences in the country, home to USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, and California, among others. It survived 2 world wars, the entire 20th century, and decades of conference realignment. It did not survive a 5-day window in the summer of 2023. June 30th, 2022. USC and UCLA announced they are leaving the Pac-12 for the Big Ten, effective 2024, chasing the television money the Big Ten's new $7 billion deal represented. That single decision starts the countdown. Fast forward to the summer of 2023. Commissioner George Kliavkoff is negotiating a new media rights deal with Apple to stream Pac-12 content directly to subscribers at a minimum guaranteed payout of $20 million per school per year. On the evening of August 1st, 2023, the conference's remaining schools meet, and by all accounts leave the meeting with what the board chair later described as a strong feeling of staying together. 9 schools are set to sign the new Apple agreement the following morning. They never got the chance. On the morning of August 4th, 2023, 4 days after that meeting, Oregon and Washington announced they are leaving for the Big Ten instead of signing the Apple deal. Within the same week, Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah announced they are leaving for the Big 12. Colorado had already announced its return to the Big 12 a week earlier, on July 27th. In roughly 5 days, 8 of the conference's 12-member schools were gone. What remained of a conference founded in 1915 that had crowned Rose Bowl champions for generations was 4 schools: Stanford, California, Oregon State, and Washington State. Two of those four, Stanford and California, would go on to leave for the Atlantic Coast Conference the following year, a conference on the opposite side of the continent, purely to remain inside a power conference television revenue tier. The Pac-12 didn't collapse because its teams stopped winning games. USC and Oregon remained nationally competitive programs through the entire collapse. It collapsed because a television rights negotiation came down to the wire at the exact moment the conference's two most valuable remaining programs had a better offer sitting in their inbox, and once two schools left, the fear of being the last one standing when the music stopped did the rest. The aftermath tells you just as much as the collapse itself. The rebuilt Pac-12 that exists today is not the century-old power conference that crowned Rose Bowl champions. It's a smaller league stitched back together with schools pulled up from the Mountain West, chasing a media deal a fraction of the size of what the Big Ten and SEC now command. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Coast Conference, watching two of its own marquee programs, Clemson and Florida State, publicly explore an exit over dissatisfaction with its media revenue, had to negotiate a settlement just to keep its own membership from following the Pac-12's exact playbook. The threat wasn't hypothetical. It was the same television money logic, aimed at a different conference, defused just before it detonated. The box that was checked back in Indianapolis still says nonprofit. But nonprofits don't usually lose a 100-year-old institution over a streaming contract negotiation. Businesses do that. And for 5 days in August 2023, college sports looked exactly like what it had always structurally been. So who actually wins in a system built like this? Not the athlete in the sport that isn't football. That much is measurable. 5% of the revenue share pool, split across every other sport combined, at a school where the head coach alone can earn $13 million, tells you exactly where that athlete sits in the hierarchy. Not, in most cases, the university's academic mission either. Rutgers loses over $70 million a year in a conference worth more than $1 billion annually in television revenue. James Madison bills its students $55.5 million to keep its program running. The money moving through the system doesn't reliably subsidize the classroom. In a majority of cases, the classroom, through mandatory fees and institutional support, subsidizes the stadium. The clearest winners are the parties who never have to play a single down. Television networks buy a predictable, high-rated live product for a fixed multi-year price, and that price keeps rising regardless of which specific 18-year-olds are wearing the jersey that season. Conferences function as the toll booth between the networks and the schools, collecting a percentage before a single dollar reaches campus. Head coaches, in the current market, are paid closer to professional sports rates than academic sector rates, with contracts that guarantee tens of millions even if they're fired. And the NCAA itself, the nonprofit at the center of it all, generated a record $1.38 billion in the same fiscal year. Its own audited financial statement showed its net assets collapsing from positive $565 million to negative $1.97 billion. Almost entirely because it now owes $2.8 billion in back damages to the athletes its old rules underpaid for a decade. That last detail is worth sitting with. The organization that spent most of a century enforcing the rule that athletes couldn't be paid is now, itself, the single largest debtor in the room, owing nearly $3 billion specifically because that rule existed. The nonprofit box on the paperwork never had to change. Only the balance sheet did. Football players, in the current era, are winning more than at any point in the sport's history, projected to collectively earn $2.4 billion in 2026 and $2.6 billion in 2027. That's real, and it's not nothing. But it arrived only after 2 decades of litigation, 1 unanimous Supreme Court decision, and a $2.8 billion settlement that had to force the system's hand. Nobody at the top of this pyramid gave that money away voluntarily. It was extracted, one lawsuit at a time. There's a newer entrant to this list of winners worth naming, because it's the clearest signal of where the industry believes the money is headed next: outside capital. Private investment firms have started pitching athletic departments directly, offering to fund the settlement's back damages payments or the new revenue share pool in exchange for a future cut of media and sponsorship earnings. One venture partner has even pitched carving the lower-tier football championship out of the NCAA structure entirely and running it as a separate, privately capitalized entity. When an industry that spent a century insisting it wasn't a business starts fielding unsolicited offers from private equity, that's not a rumor. That's a valuation. Compare that trajectory to what's happening one tier down. In the sports the settlements formula treats as an afterthought. A wrestler, a rower, a women's soccer player at a school allocating 85% of its revenue share pool to football alone is competing at the same level of NCAA compliance. The same practice hours, the same drug testing, the same academic requirements, for a claim on 5% of what's left. The rulebook that used to say nobody gets paid has been replaced by a rulebook that says almost everybody in football gets paid, and almost nobody else does. That's not the abolition of an unfair system. It's a redrawing of exactly where the unfairness sits. Here's where that leaves you. If you're the 18-year-old walking onto campus this fall with a scholarship offer in hand and a jersey number waiting for you, you are entering an industry that generated $11.84 billion last year through the top 75 programs alone, an industry finally required, by court order, to share some of that money with you directly. You are also entering it at a school where, statistically, there's better than a 9 in 10 chance the athletic department itself is running a deficit, propped up by your classmates' tuition bills. Both of those facts are true about the exact same building. The nonprofit box is still checked. The television contracts keep getting bigger. The coaches keep getting paid like league commissioners. And the sport you play determines, almost entirely, which side of that split you land on. Look at the two athletes standing next to each other in the locker room tunnel before kickoff. One of them is on a scholarship worth 6 figures in tuition and housing, plus a direct revenue share check that could exceed what most of their professors earn in a year. The other is on the roster because of a grandfather clause that expires the moment they graduate, playing a sport that receives a rounding error share of the same pool, at a school that may be quietly billing the classmates in the stands to keep the whole operation solvent. Both of them check the same box on their admissions form. Both of them are, on paper, student-athletes at a nonprofit institution. So here are the two questions this leaves open, and they don't have the same answer. Is this finally what it looks like when college athletes get paid what the market has always said they were worth? Or is it what it looks like when an industry gets caught, forced to change the smallest amount necessary, and lets everyone call it progress?